Hello everyone, this is Natalie again. Today we're going to talk about a two-part lesson on salvation history, what I call a salvation history timeline. We're going to talk about the first part of it today, and I may cover the rest in one or possibly two more videos. This is an important part of my class, the first several, 3-4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks, because one of my other CCD teachers and I have talked for many years that our students, they can learn stories and they can learn the Ten Commandments and different parts of our faith, but unless they can put it all together, it doesn't make sense. So this is one way that I hope that I can help them put some of these things together and start to make sense of our faith. The idea is that it's a timeline. We know that God created the world and Adam and Eve were in the garden, and then of course after they committed the first sin, they were expelled from the garden. However, at that time, God promised to send a Savior. So after that, I try to explain to my students, God's people still had to remain faithful. God promised a Savior, but He didn't promise right away that He would send a Savior. They had to wait for a Savior to come for a few thousand years. During that time, they had to remain faithful. So I have a timeline, it's on the board, it's kind of too big to put on a little piece of paper, but this is the idea. On my chalkboard I have all the way across, waiting for a Savior, that we start with creation, and then we have a little picture of Adam and Eve. I like to add small illustrations on my chalkboard as we talk about these stories. Adam and Eve there, and then we go on. We start with Noah and Abraham. Those would be the most ancient ones that we have. All of these stories that we talked about are some of God's people and how they were faithful to God while they were waiting for a Savior. The first one is Noah's Ark. I have a lot of these books like this, and you know, they have kind of cartoony pictures, but they're a quick read, but yet they get the point across for the second graders. So Noah, we know that he was faithful. He built an ark even though it was a really crazy thing that God asked him to do. And his friends and neighbors made fun of him, but he stayed faithful. And then we go on with that story. The next story would be Abraham. I don't have one of those small little books about Abraham. Abraham, I found it's a little harder to find much for kids in some of this Old Testament stuff. I don't know why, really. But anyway, in your children's Bibles, you'll be able to find something about Abraham. We want to get across the fact that God promised that He would be the father of many nations and that his descendants would be more numerous than the stars in the sky, even though at that time he was very old and so was his wife Sarah. But Abraham was faithful and he believed God when God told him that. So then years later, finally they had a son. But then what happened? God asked Abraham, you have to sacrifice your son, your only son, the one you love. But what did Abraham do? He was faithful. He was faithful to what God asked, and he went up on the hill and he brought the wood for the burnt offering and all that, and he almost had to sacrifice Isaac, but at the very last second, the angel came and said, no, Abraham, don't do that. So we can get the point across that Abraham loved God so much that he would have sacrificed even his only son. Again, that's very ancient times, and I have always had a hard time finding a lot of children's things for your Old Testament, with the exception of Noah's Ark. Now, about this point in time, Moses comes into play, although I typically skip over Moses at this point, because Moses, it's a very long story, and we really have to get into it a lot. So I skip over it now and move on into it for probably 2 class periods alone, because we really have to understand the Passover and things like that. So I skip over that. The next thing, David. Of course, we all know the story about David. There's several stories you could tell. This is a typical story you would tell to second graders, is David as a boy when he faces Goliath. The main thing about that is he believed God would protect him. When he was facing the giant, he prayed before he went into battle, and of course we know he was victorious. That's another example of how one of God's people were faithful while they were waiting for a Savior. that's how much I got through this week. Next week I'm going to add, I'll probably read Jonah and probably a story about Daniel. Those would be a little later in the prophets, as far as later in the timeline. But again, I have books like this on them. They go fast, and they're just examples. I think small children learn from stories very well. So that's why I try to read the stories, but also put them on the timeline so that we can begin to understand when this happened and how it all fits together. After those stories, if we have time, depending on the way the class goes, I oftentimes have something else to reinforce the story. Now, this happens to be just a coloring sheet. Like I said, Abraham, it's kind of hard to find stuff about him. This is just a coloring sheet I got from one of those free coloring sites with him sacrificing Isaac. One thing I do like a lot, this is similar to what I had for Adam and Eve. It's a notebooking sheet. This happens to be from Catholic Icing. In this case, with Noah's Ark, they could draw a picture and then write a phrase or so about Noah's Ark. Again, we didn't get to these particular ones. We really only got through the stories, and then we wrote on the timeline where Noah and Abraham fit. The other thing I've used from time to time, this is another free site. I think it's DLTK Bible. You can get some crossword puzzles from them. Second graders it's a little hard for them to do crossword puzzles. I don't think they do much of that in school. So I've done these from time to time, but it's usually a pretty big struggle, not because they can't write or even read some of these, although some of them are large words, but because they don't understand how a crossword puzzle works. So I don't use this a lot. It kind of depends on the class that I have, because I really don't have time to explain how a crossword puzzle works. We're trying to learn about David and Goliath, and just teaching how a crossword puzzle works just takes more time than I have. But anyways, an idea, particularly if you had a little older kids, 3rd or 4th grade, I think this would probably be more appropriate in their case. Like I said, that would be the ones I would add to the timeline primarily, and I would leave a big area in the middle, and I would say we have an extra special story to fit in here. Sometimes somebody will mention something, oh, what about Moses? Isn't he there someplace? And I say, yes, he's in this area, and he's got an extra special story that we need to talk about, a special day just for him. And then I do leave that timeline up for the entire time that we're talking about it. Sometimes I have had them take this timeline and draw it out themselves, just kind of so they can remember, and maybe draw a picture for each of the items that we have on there so they can take it home and share it with their families. That's all for the timeline, and next we will fill in the center when we talk about Moses. Talk to you later.